There are exceptions to just about every rule, including money rules. So at times, you might have to choose the lesser of two evils and do things that aren't really ideal, or even things that us finance people don't really recommend. I mean, life happens and sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do. So here's a look at a few money rules that are okay to break when your back is up against the wall. To start us off, you might have to ditch the 50-30-20 budgeting rule. Now, I personally like this rule because I do feel that it is a healthy balance, and it basically involves spending no more than 50% of your take-home pay on needs, 30% on wants, and 20% on savings and debt repayment. And it's a great guide because if you're able to keep your needs and wants within the first two percentages, you will always have money left for saving. So it basically teaches you how to strike a balance and keep your spending reasonable. The problem though is that for a lot of people, keeping their needs within 50% of their take-home pay is nearly impossible through no fault of their own. Housing has increased, food has increased, daycare is higher, and the list goes on. So for many, 50-30-20 is just simply unrealistic, and no matter how they work the numbers, it's not going to work. So if you find that the 50-30-20 budget is just not working for you, you have to tweak it. And the best way to do that is to first add up all of your needs and figure out how much of your take-home pay you're currently spending on these expenses. And for anyone who doesn't know, needs are basically those expenses that aren't a choice. And once you understand the percentage of your take-home pay that you're currently spending on needs, you can then create a budget that makes sense for you. So let's say you're currently spending 70% on needs. In this case, a more realistic budget would be a 70-20-10 split. And one reason why it is so hard for so many people to stick with a budget plan is because it has become much harder to keep your housing costs low. Another piece of advice that you'll hear often is that you shouldn't spend more than 30% of your income on housing. If you can spend less, that's even better, but 30% is typically the max. But as we know, depending on where you live, housing costs have gone through the roof, and that's whether you're buying or renting. And unless you make good money, or you're sharing the cost with someone, or you got your foot in the door years ago, finding something at 30% or less can be challenging. It's gotten to the point where some people are now spending as much as 50% of their income on housing alone, which is dangerous, and it's something that I would never recommend because once you get to this point, there's very little left for other financial goals. But again, sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do because you need a place to live. But even if you have to spend more than 30%, try not to go as high as 50% if at all possible. If you can, keep it around that 35% to 40% range. Also, if you're trying to simplify your finances, automating your bills is an excellent way to do this. Not only does it result in one less thing on your to-do list, it also prevents forgetting about a bill and getting hit with late fees. But even though you might frequently hear that phrase, set it and forget it, you really have to take it with a grain of salt, especially if things are tight or you're living paycheck to paycheck. Because the last thing you want is for an auto draft to come through your account when you don't have enough funds to cover the bill. Because not only will the company charge a late fee, but your bank might also charge a fee. So even though it's good to set up automated payments, if you don't have a lot of wiggle room, you might also set due date reminders. So a few days before a scheduled draft, you can hop on online banking, make sure everything is good. That way you don't get hit with an overdraft. Another rule that you might break when things aren't going well financially is the one that recommends saving 10 to 15% of your income. Piggybacking off of what we said earlier about housing costs increasing and how some people have no choice but to spend more than 30%, if you fall into that category and you're not a high earner or you have other priorities, saving even 10% of your income every single month can be a stretch. And that can be discouraging, and it might even get to a point where you feel as if you're spinning your wheels and you're getting nowhere, and you might even feel that if you can't save a lot, then what's the point of saving at all? And even if you are able to put away this amount every month, you might find yourself dipping back into your savings and pulling out money to cover essentials. And if that is the case, don't feel guilty if you have to scale back and maybe only save 5% of your income, especially if you've taken steps to reduce spending and there's nowhere else to cut back. Likewise, depending on how tight things become or how long you have problems, you might even have to temporarily reduce your retirement contributions. And finally, another rule that you might have to break if you're having money problems is the one that says not to carry a credit card balance from month to month. And I purposely did not mention this one until the end because this is the one that I want you to try and avoid for as long as you can. Even when we do everything right financially, life does not always go our way. You might be frugal, work hard, and prioritize saving money, And then everything gets flipped upside down where you lose your job, you burn through your savings, and you can't bring in enough money to cover your expenses. And when all of that happens, sometimes you have no choice but to use a credit card for necessities, which can include food, fuel, and bills. And sometimes you end up carrying that balance from month to month. Stuff like this happens to responsible people every single day. So if you're living this at the moment and you've done everything possible to avoid this outcome and there are no other solutions, use the credit card. Because when it's all said and done, you need food, you need fuel, you need utilities, you need water. But the key here is to use it as a last resort, to only use it for necessities, and if possible, use your credit card with the lowest rate. That way, it'll be a little easier to pay off the balance once you get back on your feet.